Welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, Pat and I are going to be talking about helmets, headwear, caps, and all other head-related accoutrements that people can be using for airsoft. This idea came to me after conversation on the Discord, actually with Todd, talking about doing a helmet review or an overview, I should say, of the way I have my helmet set up. And I thought it'd be a good idea, and certainly something that I'm going to be looking at doing. But I thought I might have a conversation with Pat about headwear in general. And Pat and I, as we've mentioned before, we've been playing airsoft for a very long time. And in that time, we have had the opportunity to wear a variety of different types and styles of headwear.
To different effects as well and effectiveness.
Yeah, totally.
It's been a consistent thing in the sense that we've consistently tried out new stuff because it's fairly easy to put on a hat or helmet, relatively speaking.
Yeah, and the thing that we see a lot in airsoft as well is when you go to the local field, you have tons of people who are either wearing a fast helmet, right? If they're doing more of a, let's say, NATO style kit, or some sort of Russian helmet with one of those face plates and the blast shield or whatever it is that they have to do to shoot the proton torpedoes into the Death Star. I don't really know. But so that's what you see. And so the standard is often like, well, if I'm going to wear a helmet, then I have to wear a fast helmet. And it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be that way. And as well, you don't necessarily need to wear a helmet also. So I thought we would have a conversation about what we have done in the past. I mentioned we've worn different stuff, and we've worn, watch caps, and we've worn baseball caps, and all this kind of stuff. So we'll go into that.
The mighty boonie.
Yeah, and the boonies, absolutely. I mean, boonie is a great piece of kit, which we'll come back to for sure. And then we'll talk a little bit about sort of what I'm running right now, what Pat's running right now, and sort of the thought process behind it, and any upcoming changes that we might be anticipating. So to start off, I think we could go right, all the way back to the very beginning. Like when I started playing airsoft, I had a helmet.
Yeah, you had a Canadian Forces kind of style, relish loadout.
That was actually even before then. And I don't think you were acquainted with my airsoft stuff at the time.
Yeah, I'm not sure I saw that.
2006. So it was a very cheap knockoff Pasket. So that's, GWAT sort of helmet. And then I had a CADPAT replica, CADPAT helmet cover with a black helmet band with cat eyes on it, because I thought, that was the bee's knees. But what's important about this replica helmet, and you see this even today with a lot of different replicas, is that it was just really like a styrofoam shell inside. Like it didn't have any sort of suspension system or pads or even a way to cinch it down. So it was basically literally...
Which is sort of the quality that we could afford at the time.
Well, yes. I mean, it was $40 or whatever. But it's literally just put it on your head, put on the chin strap, and adjust it from there, which I think for many airsofters, I'm sure can... that's a story that will resonate with them, because really, if you look at a lot of cheap knockoff helmets, that's sort of the experience that you're getting, right? So that was my very first one, right? Yeah. And that was my very first game, and I had a helmet. And I think a lot of people... probably are in that same boat. And then from there, I got different helmet covers for that helmet, including a multicam one in particular, because that was the next camo that I went to. And then for years and years after that, I just wore a baseball cap. I had that baseball cap. I think I do not have it anymore. If I do, it's in very poor condition.
I was going to say that's probably because it failed structurally.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a multicam eagle cap, and I wore that in my, so to speak, mercenary PMC loadout that I had, which was the Cyraz with the black sweater and the baseball cap. And then after that, I had the properly surplused Canadian Forces Galet helmet,
Yep.
which is very similar in style to the Mitch 2000. And I had that with a custom pad system that I got aftermarket.
And like that one at
Obviously,
least
it's all
actually,
aftermarket.
like that kind of brings us to one of our key points here, right? Like, or at least one of our starting points is
Yeah,
like, the foam one had kind of the drawback of like if you're wearing it for looks, it flopped around. So like if you're wearing it for protection, like, I don't mean in the like bulletproof sense, I mean in the like if you bash your head off something, you'll be okay sense. Still iffy.
yeah,
Looked good in photos. Like, as long as you
totally.
weren't
Oh
as
yeah,
long
I
as you
mean, it
weren't
was a
moving,
great
it was
prop.
okay, right?
Yeah,
um and I feel like the surplus forces one at least, like, you know worked really well in terms of the look you were going for, and in terms of like, yeah, if you bashed your head off something, you were completely fine. um
yeah.
but I also remember it weighing a lot
Yeah, I
because
mean it was a Kevlar helmet,
yeah,
so it
like
weighed a significant amount compared to just a plastic shell. But I think, and we can get into the details later, but it had a suspension system, which means that the helmet is not actually in contact with your head. So if you actually bump it off something, it's not like braining you, right? It's like it's floating above. I mean,
it's
if you
designed for a
crunch your
certain
head
amount
in,
of
yeah.
user comfort.
And then after that, I wore a skate helmet for years and years, and now I have a fast helmet that is. It doesn't have a suspension system, but it has pads and it has an adjustment band, so I can tighten it to my head. And so all this to say that, I mean, I have a pretty wide breadth of experience when it comes to helmets
Many hats have
and
been
different
tried.
headwear. And I have a boonie hat, and I've had a boonie hat since 2010 or whatever. And those are just a great piece of kit, and I'll let Pat talk a little bit about that a bit more. But
And they're not very expensive, which is
yeah,
solid, right?
for
Like,
sure.
good and cheap.
So, Pat, from your experience, I'm looking up at a picture of you wearing a skate helmet on my wall from our group photo back in like 2016 or something. But so before that skate helmet, I think you were only using caps, right?
Yeah, so everything I used prior to the skate helmet, which I pretty much only wore for like some of that season, has been some sort of soft cover. Um,
Yeah.
let's see, I have worn a bunch of different boonies. They're sort of for me, the winner.
Hmm.
A couple of ball caps. Ball caps are hard for me because my head is enormous. Like, I'm a custom hat sizes kind of person.
Yeah.
um, and like for once, I didn't even have to make like a fat joke. Like, it was big.
Yeah. Pat's head circumference is significant.
I'd say there was a lot of brains in there, but you've been listening hopefully for a while. You've probably figured
And you
out
know that's not true.
the
Yeah.
yeah, the falsity of that statement. um, but yeah, I really find boonies super comfortable. They come in a wide variety of sizes, which is great. They come in a wide variety of camo colors, and they're cheap.
Yeah.
Also, my father finds them fun, and so he like buys random camo patterns of them and gifts them to me for Christmas. It's great. It's just a little airsoft something in my stocking kind of thing. It's very sweet of him. So I've, like I said, I've definitely preferred or like predominantly used boonies over the course of my airsoft career. At the moment, I have sort of a cycle of 3 hats depending on my mood. So the boonie definitely would have been like the first thing, because I have a like actual true spec multicam boonie that I got probably the summer I started playing airsoft. That wasn't terribly expensive. And has proven virtually indestructible.
Yeah.
I've also got just a like polar fleece watch cap that has served me really, really well. It's still, I use it for shoveling snow. It's still like a super just comfortable, close fitting, cozy hat. It's great for like later in the season when the weather is less good here. A couple of years ago, I did manage to find a ball cap that fits well enough. I use that a bunch. The priorities for me really have always been, does it break up my silhouette? Right? Like, is it an effective tool in terms of like making my head not look quite so head shaped when I pop it into a hole in the
Hmm.
cover? um, when I'm having a look around. Um, does it keep the sun off, my face and off my neck? Because like, you know, um, sunburns suck and skin cancer is a real thing. Like,
Yeah,
And I
talk
know,
to me
like,
about that right now. If
yeah, right,
you guys who are on
topical.
video can see how much of a lobster I look like
Yeah,
right
Phil
now.
is glowing,
Yeah.
and not in what the not in the luminous good way as such. So those are priorities. Honestly, I also find that having something that like shields the sun out of my eyes, and like um, that I have a magnified optic, keeps like the glare off that when I'm pulling it in towards my face, is really
Yeah,
helpful.
that's a great point.
Like, that's genuinely a utilitarian function. So at this point, like, um, I'll actually probably tuck the watch cap, the fleece cap, under a boonie, which works fine. Like, they are, I don't know if they're designed to accommodate that. Like, it actually feels like it's sort of an intended function, but like it works well. Just so that I have the little bit of visor. I wear Ear Pro, so the boonie ends up being like tucked up to the sides, which looks a little silly. But it still does all the things that I've said that I want it to do, and I always look a little silly. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna
even
say,
even
yeah.
the people who are like finding me intimidating, no one has ever found me intimidating strictly because I look scary. Like,
Yeah, really. But
well, maybe some
I
of the
think
people at sword fighting, but like,
you're listing a bunch of different reasons. I think it's worth talking about this. Like, if you're gonna wear headgear, whatever the headgear is, you need to think about you, the listener I'm talking about. You need to think about, like, what are you trying to get out of this headgear? And over the course of our time playing, that use case has changed, evolved, and has largely been dictated by the environment that we were playing in. So
it's
when
part of why I have more than one color of hat.
well, yeah, and I think, so fair play. And when I started playing airsoft, the only thing I cared about was what does the gear look like, because I didn't know any better. And so you, the
Well, you
listener,
were
might
also
be the
like
similar.
pretty impression focused early on, I think, like in
Yeah, well,
some
my
ways.
first kit was not impression focused. It was just get out there, right?
No,
And it's
fair.
like I want to look like a soldier, so soldiers wear helmets and that's it.
Yeah.
But then once you get past that point and you're like,
Google
okay,
picture of soldier.
yeah. Once you get past that point though, and you're thinking about, okay, well, looks aside, what do I need in terms of function from my headgear? Well, Pat, you already listed a few of them. Number one, like, is it keeping the sun out of my eyes? That's certainly something you want to consider.
Yeah, that's
Is
very
it break?
valuable.
Yeah, is it breaking up my silhouette? And we'll talk about helmet scrim a little bit, but absolutely, right? You want not to look like a round dome, right?
And
You
like,
want
you
to be
can
able to
scrim a boonie
conceal
too, right?
yourself.
Like, they're
Yep.
one of the things they're built with is they have a band for scrim.
Yep.
Not that if I'm being in any way honest, not that I usually take time to do that unless like Johnny is doing a bunch of scrim for the day and like walks by and tucks stuff in.
Yeah, and to be honest, again, this comes down to the environment. It's also not really relevant for us right now, right?
Yeah, that's
And
true.
then the other thing I want to mention about the environment is the reason that was, thinking about wearing a helmet for a long time when we played at Redcliffe is that the environment was hazardous. Like, there were things that were dropping down from the ceiling. You had lots of opportunities to run your head into something or bump your head on something, etc. And I mean, fundamentally, it also protects your head from BBs, although people will say, well, that's also like, oh, you're not going to feel the hit. If you're wearing a helmet and you get hit in the helmet, right? You
Yeah,
hear it, you feel it.
I
Like, it's
talking
it's
from
it's
that
a
little
thing.
bit of time wearing the skate helmet, like when someone hits you on a piece of like hard plastic gear filled with foam, you're like, oh yeah, that was a loud noise.
Yeah. So in terms of headgear, like, there's a bunch of different functions that you're looking for, and then of course, on top of it, if you're wearing any sort of like Ear Pro, if you're wearing any NVG equipment, or you're wearing a GoPro because you're making content or whatever it is, like, you need options to mount all of that, and so the headgear is also going to be a part of that, and the vast majority of people wearing like a fast helmet will be able to find very easily like a GoPro mount that fits right into the NVG mount on the front of their fast helmet.
And like,
Um,
your
and
options,
there's
if
also
you
options for like baseball caps and stuff too. But yeah,
well, I was going to say, if your options, if you're not wearing a fast helmet, are a little more limited though, right?
Mhm.
Like, we could get a some sort of headband that would wrap around my hat, I guess, or like clip onto the bill. Other than that, it's put it on your gun, right?
Yeah.
Like, so we can't really hang
So
one here.
yeah, and so if you're looking at headwear specifically because, oh well, I want to be able to mount a GoPro, well then you need to think about what are the different options, right? And for the vast majority of people, finding a piece of equipment, like for example, a helmet or whatever, and then having to modify it to be able to accommodate that is probably not going to be the move. But you have a lot of stuff that's out of the box work. So those are all the different things you want to consider. And to be honest with you, like sometimes the helmet is not going to be the best use case. I think if you're playing, there's lots of games actually where we've been quote unquote a bit more serious about our approach, and we want to maximize our usage of camouflage and concealment. And to do that meant that we had to use a boonie, because the boonie was a lot easier to conceal than it was than to do the same thing equivalently with a helmet. So that's number one. And then number two is also the weight factor. A boonie weighs nothing compared to what a helmet weighs. Now you might say, well, Phil, if you're using like a cheap knockoff helmet, the weight is comparable. Sure, fine. But if you're using a helmet that is a little bit better, if you're using even, for example, a training helmet or, a real steel surplus helmet, the weight is going to be significantly higher. So that's something you want to consider also, right?
One of the big ones for me, like, let's get to the skate helmet that's floating over Phil's head, or the photo of which is floating over Phil's head for me. Because this is a real problem I had, right? So probably if I were to go to a skate shop and be like, hey, can I get a skate helmet that actually fits my giant dome? They'd be like, sure, and order me one, right? I don't have a whole lot of doubt that like they could figure that out for me. But that's not what I did, because I didn't want to spend the like $150, $200 that would probably cost me. Let's be real. So I just, went to like a local sporting goods store and bought a extra large and jammed it on my dome. And like, I should have gone and dug it out and put it on for this video so that you guys could just watch it perch on my head and not actually fit. Like if I leave it on unstrapped, it just doesn't move because it's not capable of leaving once it's on. It is a friction fitted helmet. This is not a goal.
Yeah.
So, why don't I use that anymore? I mean, like the look I'm going for, is certainly no longer going, I just match whatever Phil gets. And initially a large part of it was like, yeah, Phil's got a skate helmet, a bunch of the other guys have skate helmets, I guess that's part of like the vibe, I'll grab one. But at that time I was using a skate helmet and I was using the 6094, and neither of those pieces of kit were comfortable. They're both gone, right? I don't know, the skate helmet's in the basement somewhere, but like they're both gone because they were uncomfortable. And I know we preach this periodically, so I guess it's that time again, but being comfortable makes you combat effective.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely agree.
If I am sitting there going, man, my head hurts, I'm not thinking about the game.
And I think that's a real concern that people need to be thinking about. And, when you're looking at headwear in particular, sizing is a real thing, right? Now, in airsoft replicas, sizing is not as much of a real thing. Like trying to find like, a medium versus a large in airsoft, I'm not sure you're going to, for like the $40 that you're looking at spending on a replica helmet, you're not going to find that. But it is absolutely important, right?
Totally. And like, let's be real, our replica stuff, like my one of my uncles at one point tossed a replica, just sort of standard mil-spec style helmet at me that he bought on eBay or Amazon or somewhere, AliExpress, because he wanted to use it for a helmet, on a quad, like in the woods, an ATV in the woods. And he just like, he bought it and was like, oh, this thing will absolutely not protect my helmet from like a branch that falls casually. Like it's,
yeah.
And I have no idea where it ended up. Like, I know I passed it on to someone else in the community because it would not go on my head. And the reality is that a lot of our knockoff plastic gear is coming from China, and that equally a lot of it is sized to the market it's being made in, right? And there aren't, relatively speaking, that many Chinese dudes with heads this big.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say conversely, there's a lot of different like manufacturing, like maybe levels that you might consider when you're looking at a fast helmet. And I would tell you that if you're looking at a fast helmet in particular, because that's my experience, or any helmet in general, if it's adjustable to your head size within a certain, certain band size or whatever, that's always going to be the move for you. Because Pat mentioned like being uncomfortable. And if I take my fast helmet and I cinch it down all the way tight, it's not going to be too long before I have a headache because it's too small, right? It needs to be sized appropriately. Same thing like if you've got a giant melon like Pat and you're trying to jam a skate helmet, which typically is more, let's say, form fitting, that's not good. That's going to lead to you being uncomfortable and getting headaches. And those are real things. Similarly, if you have a helmet that's very heavy, right? Because you have a Kevlar helmet or you have a helmet that you've decided to mount an NVG on, as well as a counterweight on the back, and suddenly your helmet is weighing, let's say, 10 pounds or 2.5 kilos or whatever, you're not accustomed to having that on your head all the time. And your neck is not accustomed to carrying around that kind of load. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to get fatigued because you're not accustomed to that type of weight. So these are all things that when you're thinking about headgear, like there's a lot to consider. And you really need to think about what you really need from it. Now, obviously, if you say, well, Phil, I'm playing a night game, I'm going to need to wear a helmet with NVG and a counterweight. Absolutely. But the first time you
The
play a night
advantage the night
game,
vision will give you in that night game probably outweighs the discomfort. But like,
well, perhaps,
but
but
is that true
also,
of your random skirmish?
well, and I would also say the time that you need it should probably also not be the first time that you wear it for an extended period, right? Like you probably should, like we talk about all the time, like you should train, you should do drills, you should get accustomed to your gear and stuff,
Break in your
because you
fancy
might
airsoft
find,
hat.
well, yeah, right. Like you need to get accustomed to it. So, but to come back to it, there's considerations, and you really need to think about what are you looking to get. And for our beginners out there, the helmet is not necessarily going to be the best piece of kit for you. And in fact, you might find, so obviously, impressions aside, if you're trying to do an impression, you don't need me to tell you what kind of headgear you need to wear. You know, because your impression, if you're doing a Mogadishu Black Hawk Down kind of situation, you know exactly the kind of a helmet that you need to wear because you've seen it in the movie, you've seen it in pictures, whatever, right? Nick, I'm talking about you.
You've done your research. You're good. Like,
Right? Like, but if you're like, oh, I wonder what kind of options are there or what have you, you really need to give it a shot. And there's the boonie hat is a really good a really good option. But even at our field, we have people who wear baseball caps all the time, and that's their primary headgear
and
because
that does
we're
the
not
first two things.
operating, we're not playing in a game or in a setting, sorry, where there's stuff that's going to fall down or potentially dangle down from ceilings or whatever, where you're going to like clock your head
Yeah, I mean,
as
like
you're going through a building.
the reason that, in a lot of ways, the skate helmet made sense to me for the while that I was wearing it was that a lot of our games were still being played up at Redcliffe, and there
Yeah,
was
totally.
just rebar and stuff poking out of ceilings, and it was like, yeah, you're eventually going to just dome yourself on that. And I was like, I mean, I haven't, but that, yeah, no, it is like my statistic. Not that this is how probability works, but my odds felt like they were due. Like it seemed like a good idea at the time. And
Yeah,
now we're not playing somewhere where there's very much stuff hanging out of the ceiling to bash me in the head.
yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
and like, the ball cap is honestly probably worse than the boonie in terms of like my efforts to conceal myself on that field, but also realistically, on some of the game modes we play on that field regularly, there's no concealing myself anyway, so that's just
Exactly.
going to be a thing. And like I'm
Yeah,
not
and
concerned about that as such. Um, you know, my my personal big point is honestly like, helmets are cool. Like I think Phil looks great in his. Like I think it does add to the impression. John's as well, right? And like I'm pretty sure John regularly is like wearing a World War II helmet with scrim with like modern gear, and it's just
mhm.
like, yeah, it breaks up the silhouette. It looks different. It's cool. You know, is it cool enough for me personally to go buy like a training helmet that actually fits, that looks like a fast helmet? Well, evidently not, because I haven't done it.
Yeah,
But that's
exactly.
predominantly because every time I go look at that, I'm like, that is $400. I could buy another gun. Right? Like if I'm going to drop
Yeah,
$400 on airsoft stuff, I can buy something that to me is a lot more interesting than the helmet. If I were running a GoPro, I might feel differently. If I were having trouble, if I really wanted something to hang my hearing pro off of, like there's stuff that would be useful or angles that could be useful. But for my money, it doesn't feel like a good investment currently.
Yeah, and I think if you are listening to this episode and you're like, well, I'm trying to make some decisions about what kind of head, so absolutely, like you really need to think about it. Like going out there and buying like a real steel helmet for airsoft purposes. Like if you're getting a crazy deal or something, obviously, like fill your boots, whatever. But for the average person playing airsoft,
Yeah.
especially playing airsoft like all around the world, like there's a lot of really good replica options out there. Assuming you don't have a giant noggin, right? If you have a huge head like Pat, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to find something that's appropriately sized, and you absolutely should not feel like you have to jam your head into a smaller helmet, because ultimately you're going to spend money and then you're just going to offload it because it's not going to work for
And
you.
that's really like, what I want to be, I guess, like what I want to be getting across to the big head crowd listening
Yeah.
is like, if you're wearing a helmet and you're regularly like, man, this sucks, and you're not doing it for like an impression, because like, okay, fair enough, that's a separate sort of thing. But think about whether or not it's in fact impacting your effectiveness of play and whether or not it's worth it.
Yeah,
Because like,
absolutely.
like I said, the skate helmet's still there. Like it's on top of the pile of gear I don't use, and it's going to stay on top of the pile of gear I don't use unless I like decide I want to hook it onto like a backpack for a photo shoot or something that we're doing it with like geared up, because
Yeah.
that's the only function it has for me at this point, right? No one is going
Yeah.
to bang me on the head with stuff there. They can't reach. I'm too tall.
And I want to come back to the helmet as a protective device. So if you're thinking about having a helmet that is going to provide some bump protection in some way, shape, or form, you really are going to want to make sure that the helmet is either, well, like a skate helmet or something that's rated for protection. That's certainly one thing. But you want to make sure that it has some sort of like suspension system or some sort of strap or whatever to actually absorb some of that impact. And so if all you have, like I think about that Pasket that I had, that really old helmet, really it was a plastic shell, right? And it had a styrofoam inside, right? And when I say styrofoam, I mean like styrofoam that you might see like in a pack, in like a box, like a packing crate or something like that. And like if you go full force into
The
something,
cheapest
like
styrofoam that money can
yeah,
buy.
like it's not going to protect you. So if you truly are concerned about protection, just like with iPro and everything else, like if your primary concern is your personal protection, then you should not be going cheap, right? You should at least be looking for something that will provide some modicum of protection by being, you know, uh, you know, properly rated, like a skate helmet. If your primary concern, is protection, I would highly recommend a skate helmet personally. I think they look great when they're painted for airsoft, spray painted. I think they look awesome. But that's beside the point.
I don't
You can get
disagree. Like,
NVG mounts that fit. I have one that fit right over the top, and then you can put your NVG in there. Or you can put your GoPro, whatever. Failing that, you can actually get an NVG mount and screw it right in, and have this like really cool custom helmet going on, and it will provide you the type of protection you're looking for. So that's certainly one option. But the other option is finding yourself a replica helmet or even a training helmet if you have the budget, but certainly a replica helmet that does have some of those more advanced like adjustment features and stuff to make it so it's more, appropriately sized. And you can replace the pads inside or whatever the suspension system is with something that's aftermarket that's actually good. So like you could get Skydex pads, there's all kinds of different stuff that's
the
out there. And then that will provide you that protection, but will give you the look that you're going for. So those are
the
the kinds of
the
options, right?
$40 repro on eBay actually does have some features that the $20 repro doesn't have and that you want, which is not necessarily what you'd expect.
Yeah. So those are things to consider with helmets. Again, the other thing that people should take away from this is that helmets are not the only option. So firstly, there's lots of people who I've seen, and even people on our Discord, who just wear a dye mask and a bandana. That's fine, right? That's
Yep,
absolutely okay,
totally.
because the
Works really
environment
well.
that you're in and the objective and the benefit that you're looking for should dictate what you need from your headgear, right? And not the other way. Of course, I understand airsoft is a fashion show, right? I get it. But like the environment should dictate what you need from that. So if you are playing at a field where it's super warm and you feel like a dye mask and a bandana is fine, then that's cool. A boonie cap might do
Remember
fine
to
if
go
it's a
get
little
your
cold.
Versace boonie so that you can
Yeah.
look as Gucci as me.
Yeah. Or,
That
if it's
caused
cooler,
physical pain.
Yeah. Yeah. But if it's cooler where you are, like watch caps are great. Like again, like looking up at the picture I have on my wall, like there's two or three of the guys who are just wearing like fleece watch caps basically because it was colder that day. There's snow on the ground, so that's a really good option. And you can wear that under a helmet. I've done that as well. Like I have a very thin hat, just covers my ears basically. Like it's a very thin fleece cap that I wear for running. And I wear it underneath my helmet, and that's great. That allows me to wear my helmet with my GoPro and my ear pro, but still keep my head relatively
If
warm.
you are the sort of
If
person who like plays airsoft in like halfway cold climates like we do, I also want to just like note, because I've done the running in winter thing here as well. Like the really lightweight gloves and like hats for running are wicked airsoft gear to tuck away.
Yeah,
Because you can just toss them on under a pair of tactical gloves and your hands don't freeze.
yeah.
Being able to move
So
your fingers is cool.
yeah, and I think like Pat mentioned ball caps and stuff like that too, all great options. And so if you're just starting out, I would recommend you try different things. If you're looking for the additional protection from a helmet, obviously you're doing an impression, then that's fine. But I had really good luck wearing a ball cap, and I thought they were super comfortable, super nice and light. Not having to worry about overheating, etc. It's a good piece of kit.
If
So
you're gonna wear like a cowboy hat or something, you know, please take pictures and send them to us. Really is where I'm at with
yeah,
that.
definitely.
The operation game we ran a couple of months ago, we had a guy show up in like a park ranger hat, and that was mint.
Yeah.
Very
So
distinct.
I want to talk just a little bit now about what my helmet is actually like and how I have it set up, and some general concepts that if you are going down the helmet route, things that I've done that you definitely don't want to do, and things that you may want to consider
It's
doing.
everyone's
So
favorite time. Learn from Phil and Pat's mistakes time.
yeah. So my current helmet is, as I've mentioned, it's a replica fast helmet. It's one of the more expensive one replicas that you can get. I think mine was close on $100 Canadian. Um, on the helmet, I have my Howard Light Impacts, so it's my ear protection, like enhanced hearing protection, as well as a GoPro mount for my GoPro, as you guys would know, but also an NVG battery pack. Or an NVG counterweight pouch, I should say, which I use as a battery pack. So I have a USB, like a battery bank that fits in
This
there,
is
and
how we
it's
get the
connected to my
GoPro to run all
GoPro.
day.
Exactly, or close on. It's like 5 hours or whatever. Um, and then on top of that, and I think it's worth mentioning, inside the helmet, I have custom pads. So I have some of the stock pads that came with the helmet, and mostly in the middle to keep the helmet in the right position for my head. And then on the side, I have more comfortable fabric pads that I can also wash, because guess what? Your helmet is going to get sweaty, and it's going to be an absolute nightmare, right? If you never wash it, you have to be able to wash the pads inside to get the sweat out, because otherwise you're going to give yourself, I mean, so
We
contact
I
dermatitis
was
at the
going to say,
very least.
the Stormriders believe in hygienic airsofting.
Well, let's not get carried away here. You should smell my gloves, but that's beside the point.
I do not wish to.
Ask Johnny about that someday. Um, but yeah, so you want to be able to at least wash the sweat, get the sweat out, strip the sweat out of your gear. So if you have plastic or like foam pads that don't absorb any of that sweat, well then fine. But if you're using custom pads that have fabric and stuff, it's going to absorb some of that moisture. You want to be able to clean them. So that's super super important. Um, and most of the helmet bands, like if you have a helmet that's a little bit on the pricier side, you should be able to remove all of that hardware and service it yourself. So that's so that you're only left with the shell. That's really important for me. Like I want to be able to service all of that. And in the case of my helmet, I absolutely can remove all the band, the suspension system, all that, remove it, clean it all out, and then put it back. Do I do that like with any level of frequency? Absolutely not. Aside from cleaning the pads to get the sweat out, but it's important, in my opinion, to be able to do
And
that.
at least
So
if you need to, you can, right? Like that feels like the
yeah,
key piece is,
yeah. If your helmet gets gross, man, yeah. And like I said, like contact dermatitis is a real thing. Like if all your gear is sweaty and gross all the time, and you're putting that against your skin all the time, it's gonna make it. You could potentially get rashes and itches and stuff, and it's not fun. So that's certainly one piece. The other thing about the helmet is how you actually conceal it. So number one, you absolutely at the bare minimum, at the bare minimum, you need to paint your helmet, right? You can't just leave it. I mean, you certainly can. You should not leave it just the color that it is, unless camouflage is not at all a concern where you play. So, if you're like Matt and you play CQC field indoors or whatever, then that's fine. But if you're playing outdoors and you're going to rely on some camouflage and concealment, you need to paint your helmet.
I mean, if you're playing a CQC field indoors, then like still paint your helmet. Just put like a big gnarly skull on it.
Yeah, and I don't know. Does Matt have a design on his? I'll have to ask him. I can't remember. Anyways, point is, you want to make sure that you at the very least paint your helmet, right? You want to do like a snakeskin pattern with a laundry bag, some colors, etc. Understanding too that having darker colors up higher is usually better in terms of camouflage and concealment than having lighter colors. So think about the color palette where you play and then use that to do it. But that being said, for my money, a helmet cover is much, much better than painting it. You can get fabric helmet covers for just about any helmet that's out there. And they are, for fast helmets in particular, which has been my experience in the last several years, they're super available, and you can get them in all kinds of different camo patterns. And the fabric is so important because it reflects the light a lot less than a helmet. Even if you paint a helmet with the mattest like camouflage colors you can find, it's still pretty shiny compared to a fabric helmet cover. So on my helmet, I have currently I have two different ones. I have a fleck turn one because fleck turn is awesome. Fleck turn, best turn, as they say. But the one that I use primarily is my woodland, right? The neat thing about the helmet covers is they tend to also provide you with additional Velcro that you can put stuff like patches and stuff on. Or in my case, I've got, I'm hanging the NVG mount by Velcro on the back. And they also provide loops, right? They provide loops that you can stuff vegetation through, cables if you're running your battery cable for your GoPro, etc. So helmet cover, super, super important.
And they're like, compared to the cost of even a relatively cheap repro, they're like free, right? They're $10-$20. So
yeah, well, it's actually going to cost you more money to get spray paint than if you don't have it already, than it is to get your helmet cover, right? That, to put that in perspective.
So yeah, that seems like a freebie to me, right? Like,
yeah, and you can get them in whatever pattern that you're currently wearing for your uniform. So like, all your multicam blacks, like Cryptek Highlander if you're a weirdo,
I mean, you can probably
Cad Pat, whatever.
In the bright pink camo, like it.
Yeah, definitely.
It is basically a football cover.
Okay.
Right? Like they're not complicated to make.
It's true. And you can get them for most helmets, like patterns. So like when I had my old Pasket, I had a multicam one, a Cad Pat one. You can get for Mitch 2000s, even I'm sure the Russian patterns and stuff like that.
I mean, I'm sure I could get one for the skate helmet if I wanted to. Like,
and you'll find old school helmet covers too. If you're like Johnny and you like World War II helmets and stuff, there are covers for those too in old school patterns and new school patterns too. So the helmet cover is definitely as far as I'm concerned, like spray painting is the bare bones necessity. But I would say that the helmet cover realistically is your best like minimum viable option. And then on top of that, I would say scrim. Right? We've talked about this before. I know I don't shut up about scrim, but the reality is scrimming your helmet is super, super effective. You don't have to use anything complicated. You can use an old camo net. That's what Johnny and I used. But coming back to what Pat was saying at the start about boonie hats, breaking up your silhouette is an absolutely important function, critical function of headgear when it comes to camouflage and concealment. And scrim for helmet is like the best, aside from like what they have, I think they're called miznefets, what they have in the Israeli Defense Forces that make your head look like a rock or something, like this weird thing. If you're not going to be using one of those, which I think are just hilarious, scrim is going to be your best option to break up your silhouette, right? By making the helmet not so round shape. It'll also give you the opportunity, if you're using scrim netting like we do, to just also stuff through the scrim, including additional vegetation and so on, right?
And then you get to feel spooky as you disappear into the background. Like, it does work really well.
Yeah. Yeah, it will surprise you if you've never used it before. I remember one of the first times I was using Scrim, and I also had my Delta Mic Face Pro, and I really had nothing showing aside from my red nose. And I remember like being out of cover, but in concealment, and looking directly at, I think it was Matt, uh, and Matt did not see me. Like he was looking right at me, and he did not see me. And I have that down to the camo and to the concealment because there was nothing hard in between us. Now maybe he wasn't looking at me, but I remember looking at him directly and being like, "Wow, if he wanted to shoot me right now, his BB would come directly at me and hit me." That never happened. I shot once and I was able to tag him out. So it's really hard to overstate the benefits of appropriate camouflage and concealment, and the helmet is a core function of that. And functionally, for the added cost of getting some camo netting or something to scrim up your helmet, it doesn't have to be camo netting. Like you can get any sort of like netting, like a volleyball net or something, cut it to fit your helmet, and then start tying burlap. Johnny did that with his World War II helmets, right? Dyeing or having colored burlap and just stuffing it in there. And in fact, many helmets, makes and models, you can actually get specifically designed camo netting that stuffs. That fits over the helmet and stuffs underneath the suspension system and stuff, and all of that is really really helpful in making sure that you can conceal your helmet as best as possible.
And like, you know, not to necessarily say, oh, like because it exists for military use, it's useful to us, but there's a reason those nets exist.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? Like camouflage and concealment, the concepts that we apply in airsoft, like we always say that just because it works in the military doesn't necessarily work for us. But camouflage and concealment applies to confusing humans. Period. Right? Full stop. So if that helps confuse humans in a war zone or whatever, it can certainly you can certainly apply similar concepts to keep yourself sort of hidden on the field, right? And I've mentioned this in the past, but this is a place where airsofters really, in my opinion, really are lacking. Most people do not take the required steps to camouflage their head. They'll wear a BDU, they might even have matching gear, but they don't take the necessary steps to really truly camouflage and conceal their head, break up the silhouette, etc. So this is something that is really pays dividends, and all it mostly takes is time, right? It's an investment of time. The resources that are required once you already have your helmet and stuff is pretty low, right?
Yeah, I mean, like burlap and spray paint the burlap will work, right? Like, it's a way, it's not an efficient way of coloring it, but like,
Yeah, yeah,
it'll do the job. And a burlap sack is like, you have one, you bought potatoes, enjoy. Like it's
yeah.
not an expensive material by any stretch. So yeah, I mean, it's also neat talking about this because I'm sort of sitting here thinking like, I've worn the ball cap a lot this season when I played, and I should probably switch to the boonie and just like, actually make a little more effort to, uh, opt into concealment when I'm using, especially the M27, because I've got the range to make good use of it.
Yeah, and to talk about boonies a little bit, I think we've talked a lot about helmets, and that's been my experience. But in the last couple of years, but boonies as well, like they have vegetation loops and stuff that make it easy for you to stuff to stuff veg, branches, leaves, burlap, whatever it is, right? The advantage of using like pre-made scrim is that it's not going to go bad. If you stuff like leaves and stuff, those are
You have to
eventually
clean
going
it
to
out
rot
every couple of
away.
weeks.
You have to clean it out, right? So if you can take the time at home to use burlap or whatever else to properly camouflage your helmet, and then add a little bit of veg if you need to,
I
or
should hit
whatever,
John up for
local
some
veg.
burlap.
Yeah. And it's extremely available. Like Pat was saying, like surely I don't know if anybody's really buying potatoes and burlap sacks these days. However, Pat is old, so I'll forgive him for that. Um,
I'll go get McCain.
but in point of fact, Pat is 14 days younger than me. But that for who am I? Who am I to take that away from him? But yeah, so to come back to it, like you can get burlap at basically any home like hardware store. They use burlap or jute to cover up, um, stuff during the winter, etc. So it's available to you. It's not very expensive, and you can use it on your boonies. You can use it. I mean, even on your baseball caps if you want to get really creative. Um, and but certainly on your helmets. So for those of you who are listening to us today, and you're starting out, you're not really sure. So number one, don't feel obliged to use a helmet. But if you are going to use a helmet, you got to take the steps to make sure that it's properly sized for you, that you're, setting it up correctly for yourself, that it's comfortable for extended periods of use, and that it's working for you, not against you. And I think that's like Pat was saying earlier, it's a consistent message for all the conversations that we have when it comes to gear, right? It's got to work for you.
Yeah. Think about your kit. Think about whether or not it is giving you advantage or disadvantage, right? And
Yeah.
like this applies as a metric to, for people who, and I have been this person out like, oh, but I spent money on it. I got to keep using it. This applies as a metric to like all of your gear, right? If your gloves are too small or too big, that's worth thinking about,
Yeah.
And it's amazing what relatively cheap modifications to your kit can do in terms of your comfort and thus in terms of your efficacy on the field.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to ditch it, right? I mean, like, again, like Pat was saying, like if you're not comfortable with it, like next time you play, just don't wear it and see what happens, right? Like wear a ball cap. Like John for the last not certainly not last game, but he's worn like his New York Rangers baseball cap for many games because that's what was comfortable, and that's okay. Give it a shot, and like worst case scenario, you find that that's even worse. Sure, but then maybe you find that that's better. You enjoy it more. You're more effective, and then you work from there, right? It should be a work in progress. And so if you're looking at the field and you look at, and we see this all the time, like people wearing helmets that aren't properly sized, properly fitted, etc. Like it's much better for you to figure out what doesn't work for you and then just use that than try and force yourself. And I think Pat talked about this, force yourself to fit in because that's what my teammates use. Well, if it works for them, great, but that doesn't mean it has to work for you.
100%. And, also if you're like I have been in the past and you have teammates who are using different stuff, ask them why. Try it if you can.
Absolutely.
Like,
unless their helmet is really sweaty, like mine.
Yeah,
you don't want to try mine. I
don't try
promise you.
Phil's helmet. It's a bad idea. But like the chest rig that I wear, I have because Mark and Cal both had access to them, and I used theirs and was like, where do I insert my money?
Yeah, totally. Well, guys, hopefully you took something away from this conversation about headgear. Like, there's really a lot that we could say on the topic, but I think this will suffice as a primer. I will be doing a full like video review of my helmet, so you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about in this episode. But like I'm very satisfied with how this is working for me. And so I don't have any plans to change in the future, but hopefully you guys take something away that allows you to be a bit critical perhaps about your own setup and see if there's any ways that you can improve on it. And if not, then great. But if so, then hopefully you're able to glean something that allows you to try something different, try something more enjoyable, and just get just that little bit of extra edge the next time you play. And hopefully that'll be you.
And like if you have some other piece of headgear that we haven't touched on that you use regularly, please like reach out. We're both down to try new stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
It needs to come in size ridiculous for me, but the idea is appealing.
Absolutely. But until you do that, until you join the Discord and tell us about the crazy type of headwear that you wear that we don't know about, that's all we got for you. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Have a good week.